Please remember that the complete information for the class that you are about to view is at elithecomputerguy.com. Not only do we have our videos there, but we have part lists, diagrams, pictures, and even complete code examples. So if you are watching this video and you want more information, please go to elithecomputerguy.com. Welcome back. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy, and in today's class, I'm going to be showing you how to install an operating system onto your Raspberry Pi. So if you're used to installing operating systems onto other types of computers, the important thing to understand here is that it's very simple to install an operating system onto a Raspberry Pi, but it's an entirely different process. You're not going to be dealing with BIOS, you're not going to be dealing with UEFI, you're not going to be dealing with boot order or any of that type of thing. The way you install an operating system onto a Raspberry Pi is entirely different than installing Windows or Linux or anything else into a normal PC environment. So basically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be going to the Raspberry Pi website, you're going to be downloading imaging software, and basically what this imaging software will do is it will take an operating system file and basically it will copy it to your micro SD card that you will have connected to your computer. This micro SD card will then become a bootable operating system. You slot that micro SD card into your Raspberry Pi, you plug the Raspberry Pi into a monitor, keyboard, mouse, and a network cable, and voila, you have now installed the operating system. Once you boot the Raspberry Pi up for the first time with that new operating system, you'll have to go through a couple of setup procedures, but really there's not a whole lot to it. Basically, add a password, add wireless configuration, so on and so forth. So it is important to understand when you're going to be installing an operating system for a Raspberry Pi, it is very simple, but it is a completely different way of doing things than you may be used to if you've installed operating systems on standard PCs. So there's no huge warnings for today's class, but one of the big things that you do have to keep in mind is that you do actually need some way to plug an SD card or a micro SD card into your computer. So the demonstration system that I'll be using today is my MacBook Pro. The software, the imaging software, works the same, identically if you're using a Windows 10 computer, but you need an SD card or a micro SD card slot. If you don't have one built into the computer, you are going to need an additional adapter. This is just one of those things that can kind of trip you up where you know exactly what you need to do. You just need to buy the $15 widget in order to make it happen. Past that, when you're dealing with a micro SD card, one of the things to keep in mind is you should have a micro SD card that has at least 8 gigs of storage. Technically, you can do some of the different distributions you can install onto the Raspberry Pi using 4 gigs of storage, but for what I'm showing you today and basically standard, you should have at least 8 gigs of storage. I would really say like 16 gigs of storage. Remember, whenever they give you a minimum requirement, it's best to just double it. So I would say you should have 16 gigs of storage, but you do need a minimum of 8 gigs of storage. Beyond that, do realize that micro SD cards can be a little bit quirky, as they say. I have numerous micro SD cards because of what I do, and I have found one of my micro SD cards, it works perfectly in a camera. It works perfectly in a normal camera. It works perfectly for a lot of things that I use it for, but when I actually try to run an operating system off of that particular micro SD card, it fails out. So that's just one of those things just to kind of keep in mind. If you're having issues booting off of your micro SD card, it is most likely not a problem where you're doing something wrong. Again, there's not a whole lot to this process. It's most likely not that you're doing something wrong. It's most likely there's a problem with your micro SD card. And so it's kind of one of those, credit card troubleshooting processes, as I say. Swipe the credit card, buy another micro SD card, and you will probably fix the problem. So there isn't really anything that's going to be able to catch you up today. Just do make sure that you have a good micro SD card, or if your micro SD card is not allowing you to boot, you may have to get a different one, and somehow you have to actually be able to plug that micro SD card into your computer so that you can actually image the operating system. So those are some of the things to be thinking about. With that, let's go over to my demonstration computer so I can show you how to actually create the operating system. Then we'll plug this into the Raspberry Pi and I'll show you the initial startup routine. So here we are at my demonstration machine. Again, this is a MacBook Pro, but frankly, it really does not matter. There's versions of the imaging software for Windows, Mac, and Ubuntu. So it doesn't matter what type of computer you're using, the software will run the same on any type of computer. The big thing is that you have an SD card slot, so you can actually plug it into the computer so you can actually create the image. So here we are at raspberrypi.org, and I've simply gone to the Downloads tab. When you go to the Downloads tab, right up at the top, it has the links for the Imager software. So they have Imager for Windows, Imager for Mac, and Imager for Ubuntu. So again, you just simply download this, and then you will install it. Once once you've installed it, it will then give you options for different operating systems that you can install. So there are some default standard operating systems that they give you. So obviously they give you the Raspberry Pi OS. So the Raspberry Pi OS is simply just a variation of Linux. And so it's a Linux distribution that has simply been optimized for the Raspberry Pi world. But if you go down, you can see there are some other standard operating systems that you can install into your Raspberry Pi. They have Ubuntu Mate, Ubuntu Core, Ubuntu Server, OSMC, LibreElec, Mozilla Web Things, so on and so forth. So these are all included within the imaging package. And so basically you can simply download, install the Imager software, and then you can create an operating system micro SD with one of these different operating systems on there, no sweat. The cool thing is with the imaging software, it does allow you to install other images. So if there are other variations of Linux that you want to install on your Raspberry Pi, if you can find an image file that works on a Raspberry Pi, you can install it too using the imaging software. So again, I know a lot of folks out there are going to be liking Kali. I know a lot of you are going to be like, how do I install Kali? Well, basically, if you go over to offensivesecurity.com, so Kali is the hackers operating system, Linux operating system. You can come here and you can see if we scroll all the way down, where is it? They have the Raspberry Pi version. So the Raspberry Pi Foundation, so they actually have versions of Kali for the Raspberry Pi. So you would download this .img file, and then you could use the imaging software to install that if you wanted to. So let's go down here. Basically, I'm going to open up the Raspberry Pi Imager, and this is the software. There's just really not a whole hell of a lot to it, right? So basically, you choose the OS, you choose the SD card, you want to burn the OS too, and away you go. So here, if I do choose the OS, what we can see is these are all the standard operating systems. So this is completely built in. I did not have to add these operating systems. I didn't have to add any additional files. When I downloaded this Imager software, these are the operating systems that are included. So they have the Raspberry Pi OS 32-bit, which they recommend. They have the other, so they have other versions of the Raspberry Pi OS if you want, like the light version, LibreElec. They have versions of Ubuntu, so Ubuntu 20.04 LTS, 32-bit version, 64-bit version. They have the core version, so those are there. And we go down and we can see that basically these are the different versions that are simply built into the Imager software. If we wanted to install a different operating system using a .img file, we could do use custom, and if I click on the use custom, basically what this will do is this will allow me to select the custom image file, and then I'll be able to install it onto the micro SD card. What I would recommend is that you start with Raspberry Pi, make sure all of this works properly, and then go and experiment. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be selecting the Raspberry Pi OS, and then what I will do is I will take my little micro SD card, plug it into the little adapter, and then plug it into my computer. So I'll plug it into my computer. We can then do choose SD card, and now we can see that the SD card has now shown up. So the version that I'm using simply has 16 gigs of storage. So I will select on that, and then I will simply do write. Once it does write, it will then ask me for my password. I will flip you away for a second. And now once I've given it the password, it is now, as you can see, it is now writing to that little micro SD card. Depending on how big your micro SD card and how fast your micro SD card, this process will take, anywhere between maybe something like 2 minutes to 5 minutes. So the first thing it does is it goes through and it writes to the micro SD card, and then after it's written to the micro SD card, it then verifies what's been written to the micro SD card. And so like I say, this process just takes a couple of minutes. And so we get to the end of the installation process, and that's really all there is to it. So then we can simply hit the continue here. I can go down, make sure the SD card has actually been ejected, so I can pull it out of the computer. And now I'll pull the micro SD card out of the computer so that we can plug it into the Raspberry Pi. And we will go over to my little workbench area so I can show you basically how to connect everything to the Raspberry Pi. And then we'll do the initial boot up process and show you what it's like to finish the installation. So here we have the Raspberry Pi. Basically all you need to do is you need to flip it over and then pull the micro SD card out of the little SD card adapter, and then I just shove it in the little slot down here, and that's all you need to do to install your storage onto the Raspberry Pi. Past that, you need to connect everything up. So I've got a mouse here, So I take the USB mouse, oops, and I will plug that into the USB 2 ports. Do remember, especially if you're dealing with the Raspberry Pi 4 or the versions of the Raspberry Pi, you have some USB 2 ports and some USB 3 ports. So the USB 3 ports are the blue ports here, so you don't want to waste USB 3 ports on, a mouse. So you plug the mouse and you plug the keyboard into the USB 2 ports. So that's the mouse, and again, I've just got a standard keyboard here, so we'll be plugging these in. That's one thing you'll see when you look at buying a Raspberry Pi. They have different kits, and some of the kits have like official mice and keyboard, but other than being simply having this red and white color scheme, there's no real benefit to having those particular keyboards. So if you have USB keyboards and mice sitting around, just use those. So beyond that, then we're going to go and we're going to plug the network cable in. So when we go and do the initial update process, it'll be able to grab an IP address and it will be able to update itself. Then past that, you are going to need to be able to plug your Raspberry Pi into your screen or your monitor. Do remember with the Raspberry Pi, it is micro HDMI cables. So if you have a micro HDMI coming out of the Raspberry Pi, you're either going to need an adapter like this. So this is micro HDMI to full-size HDMI, or I have it somewhere. I actually, because I do all this video stuff, I actually have a cable, and you can buy cables that simply have micro HDMI on one side and full-size HDMI on the other. And this is actually what I would recommend that you have. Then you don't have to worry about any kind of connections or problems with the adapter type thing. So with this, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to plug this in here, and I'm going to plug this into the video port closest to the power connector. So this is the USB power connector. I have 2 video ports on this particular Raspberry Pi. I feel more comfortable this way. I do have to say the Raspberry Pi can be a little bit quirky when you boot it the first time, and so I feel most comfortable putting it in that particular port. Is it what you need to do? I'm not sure, but it's what I'm doing. It's what I'm doing. Past that, I'm then going to go back here. I'm actually going to plug the HDMI cable into my television. And then from there, all I have to do is I simply have to take my power supply. So I have the standard Raspberry Pi USB-C power supply. I will plug this in. And then what we'll do is we will then plug this into the TV and see what happens. So now the TV is turned on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug the Raspberry Pi in. So this is what actually turns on the power. There is no physical power button on the Raspberry Pi. You are going to have to plug it and unplug it to turn it on and off. So basically here we go. We are plugging it in, and hopefully, cross your fingers, it will start to boot up and we will get something pretty. So you get a little bit of color like that. We can see that it's actually getting something. We can see these little raspberry things up there. So that's showing that it's working. So it's rebooting again. So it resized the root file system. That's just the basic process it does when it's starting up. And then we're going to go through and see what happens. So there we go. We got that. Got the raspberries again. You're going to be wanting to look for the raspberries. Basically, that shows you it's actually doing something. That goes through. We got a nice little cursor there. So again, look for the cursor, make sure something is happening. It's not actually freezing up. And there we go. There we go. That's how fast it can be. So we created the image. We plugged the image into the Raspberry Pi, and now it's all booted up. Past here, there's a few additional things you have to do just to finish up the configurations. So it shows you it's getting the IP address. So it's 192.168.1.23 here. And basically what you can do is you can go through, you can click Next. It asks you, what country, what language you're using. So we're going to go to United States. We're going to do American English and ask you the time zone. So we're going to come down here to do New York. We're going to say use US keyboard, use English language, and then we're going to click Next. So it's then going to be setting the location. So the location is obviously important for things like time and all that kind of stuff. Then past that, it's then going to ask you for a password. You can put in a password or you can leave it blank. I will simply do my super secret password of do the number locks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we're going to hit Next. Setup screen, the desktop should fill the entire screen. So basically, if you see any kind of issues around the border, you can try to modify that here. We don't see any problems like that, so we're simply going to do Next. Then it's going to be searching for a wireless network. I have a wireless network. I'm not going to worry about it right now though, so we're going to skip, but you can connect to the wireless network here. So again, this shows you the wireless networks that are available. We're going to skip that, and then it's going to ask you if you want to update the software. So we'll update the software, so we can just click next here. This is going to check for updates. And it's really not a horrible update process. So like with some operating systems, as soon as you install it, you need to do the update process. And it can be a long time. It can be a long time. With the Raspberry Pi, it's not really too long, at least as long as you have a decent internet connection. So you can actually see it's downloading the updates already. So it's able to find the updates. It's now downloading the updates. It's going to go through and do the installation process. And this whole thing probably takes, I don't know, maybe a minute or two. Now we can see we're installing the updates. And again, the process is clipping along pretty quickly for this process. And there you go. All the updates are now done. And by my clock, the entire update process took about 3 minutes. So that's really not a bad thing. We can then simply click OK. It's going to ask you to restart. So we can simply restart the Raspberry Pi, obviously just doing the normal restart process for the update. Then we can boot this thing up and we will have a fully functioning Raspberry Pi computer. And so you can see this is also one of the very nice things about the Raspberry Pi, if you're going to be deploying Raspberry Pis or playing around with them in lab environments, is literally you can have an operating system, a full operating system up and running in somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes, including all of the updates that are required. So now this is the desktop and this is the Raspberry Pi. There's not a lot to this particular OS. We go up here. We have some programming applications we can use, internet applications we can use, accessories, so on and so forth. We can go here just to show you how it works a little bit. We click on this. There is the Chromium browser will open up. One thing is the first time you have it run, it will take you a couple of seconds to open up web browsers. They will take a little bit longer. But from here, we can go to, let's say, EliTheComputerGuy.com. And as you can see, it's rather responsive. So there we go. We got a nice little Eli the Computer Guy website coming up. And so we have a full-fledged little computer. And again, we can go here. We've got the accessories. We've got graphics. We've got different things. And so we can actually start playing with our Raspberry Pi now. So this is all that is required in order to actually install an operating system onto the Raspberry Pi. Now, one of the things that I want to show you is a troubleshooting process. So whenever you're dealing with a computer, especially Raspberry Pi, you might have quirks, especially when it comes to the initial installation process. And so one of your questions has to be is, if the computer doesn't seem to be booting for some reason, why? Is it a bad SD card? Is it possibly a bad HDMI cable? Does your television or does your screen not like your Raspberry Pi for some reason? That can be an issue. So one of the things, just one of the troubleshooting processes you can do is what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to unplug it. So if I unplug it, that turns it off. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to unplug the little micro SD card. So we simply unplug the micro SD card, we put that down, and then we power on the Raspberry Pi without the micro SD card. Why I'm doing this is this will verify that the Raspberry Pi board is working at least to a degree. So you can see here is SD card not detected, SD boot failed. But what this is showing me here is if I can plug this in and this is connected to the screen, if I'm getting this, at least hopefully my Raspberry Pi board itself is working, the wire to the screen is working, the screen itself is working, so any issues that I'm having are most likely I probably have a bad micro SD card. So this is just a simple way to say, okay, I know at least the Raspberry Pi is working and that it's able to communicate with the screen, so whatever issue I'm having is probably something going on with its micro SD card. Maybe I installed a bad operating system, it got corrupted somehow, maybe the SD card itself is bad, that type of thing. So this is just a little troubleshooting procedure that you can do to verify that the board itself is at least has basic functionality. So there you go. Now you know how to install an operating system onto your Raspberry Pi. It's very, very, very simple. Basically, you just go to the Raspberry Pi website, you download the imaging software, you then select what operating system you want to burn onto your micro SD card. You do that, plug it in the Raspberry Pi, boot everything up, go through the setup routine, and voila, you're done. If you go through the full routine, it's probably going to take you somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes, but something to be thinking about if you're going to be using the Raspberry Pis in like lab environments, you just want to experiment with certain things. You don't have to go through the update process, right? A lot of people think you have to update, but if you're just spinning up Apache or some kind of LAMP server or something like that, you could skip the updates. Simply boot it up, install the additional software that you want, and you can have a fully running server, and again, like 5 to 10 minutes if that's what you want to do. The process is very simple, and again, it's one of those things that makes the Raspberry Pi a pretty cool little widget. Now, I did show you how to install the Raspberry Pi OS today, and that is something that you're going to have to be thinking when you deal with the Raspberry Pi. You're going to have to ask yourself, is what distribution of Linux or what operating system do you want to install in the Raspberry Pi? What I would recommend, if you're a brand new, you're just learning about the Raspberry Pi, simply use the Raspberry Pi OS. Especially if you go and you look for basically how-tos, if you look for any help online, a lot of the people are going to give you tips and tricks based off of using the Raspberry Pi OS. And so if you're new to the Raspberry Pi world, especially the Linux world, it would probably be best to just do the Raspberry Pi OS until you feel comfortable and branch out to a different operating system. For me, when I'm doing classes for you folks, our introductory level classes will be using the Raspberry Pi OS, again, because it's a good standard introductory operating system to use. But once we start doing more complicated things, we will move over to the Ubuntu operating system. The reason for that is kind of like the standard I've used for many, many years. I believe in standardization of equipment. So if I've already done 20 or 30 classes on Ubuntu, I already have all those classes. All of that information works the same whether you're using a Raspberry Pi or a desktop operating system. So if you know everything about Ubuntu, then you can just learn a few additional things about using Ubuntu in the Raspberry Pi world and keep going. You can basically build on the knowledge very easily. So that is something that you're going to have to be thinking about with whatever distribution you decide to use for your Raspberry Pi, is what distribution works best in your particular environment. Again, if you were really hyper-focused on hacking, not for me, but if you're really hyper-focused on hacking, then use Kali Linux. Kali Linux is the go-to for the hacking and the penetration people, so you may want to use that. Again, for me, I'm interested in IoT devices in an infrastructure type environment. I'm interested in standardization, that type of thing, so that's why I would go for Ubuntu. If you're in the Microsoft world, so if you're dealing with a Microsoft stack, you're dealing with Azure, maybe you're dealing with Active Directory, I think it's called IoT Core, so Microsoft Windows IoT Core. And so that's a Microsoft operating system that will actually run on the Raspberry Pi, so you might want to use that instead. So the particular selection of operating system, that really comes down to your situation. I'm showing you the Raspberry Pi OS today, and I'll do a number of classes on the Raspberry Pi OS just because this is a good place to start. And then once you understand how the Raspberry Pi works, we will then go to the Ubuntu world. So, as always, I enjoyed doing this class. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you like the content that I create, please think about going to elithecomputerguy.com and becoming a member or donating. Please understand that all of the educational videos are in front of the paywall. That includes the videos, that includes the notes, the diagrams, and the code example. All of that is freely available and in front of the paywall. But if you want to watch opinion videos or if you want to be able to comment, you do need to become a member. Membership is $5 a month or $60 a year and gives you access to those opinion videos and the ability to comment. If you don't want to become a member, you just want to give a one-time donation, there's also a donate button where you can do that. Please understand, in order to provide the education that I am, it does cost money. Servers cost money, equipment costs money, travel costs money. All of these things cost a reasonable amount of money, and the fact of the matter is YouTube's advertising program no longer supports creators the way that it used to. So if you want these classes to continue to stick around and you find them to be valuable, please think about either becoming a monthly member or donating a few dollars for this project.